A battleship is pulling into your harbor, not to conquer you, not to trade, to collect a bill, slow-motion ocean surface. Old film grain overlay. Close-up, ledger lines, ink stamps, wax seals. Map of the Caribbean zooming toward Venezuela, and what happens next rewires American foreign policy for a century. December 13, 1902. Puerto Cabello, a tropical afternoon. The sea looks calm, almost innocent. Then the horizon darkens, steel silhouettes, warships, British, German, they don't come with diplomats, they come with turrets. At 5 o'clock the barrels turn toward the old fort. A pause, a breath, and then the sky splits. Stone bursts into dust, walls collapse like paper, people run, windows shatter. This isn't an invasion for land, it's a collection notice delivered with artillery. Here's the twist, this wasn't really about Venezuela. It was about what Europe feared losing, and what America feared becoming. Because this moment, this blockade, this bombardment, is one of the hidden turning points of the Western Hemisphere. It's the moment Europe tests whether the Americas are still fair game. And it's the moment the United States decides it can't just observe anymore. To understand why battleships show up for money, you have to understand the country they're aiming at. Venezuela at the turn of the century is not stable, it's not predictable, it's a nation living on the edge of a knife. Independence came early in the 1800s. Peace never really arrived after it. Revolts, civil wars, strongmen, private armies. Decade after decade, power changes hands with rifles, not ballots. So the state develops a deadly habit. It borrows like tomorrow is guaranteed, even when tomorrow is a gunfight. And when you borrow during chaos, you don't just owe money. You owe leverage. European banks lend. European contractors build railways, ports, telegraphs. Then the next civil war breaks the rails, burns the warehouses, seizes property, and the debt stays even when the country changes rulers. By the time the next strongman arrives, the treasury isn't just low, it's haunted. Haunted by unpaid bonds, unpaid claims, unpaid compensation demands from angry foreigners. And in 1899, a new man rides into the capital. A man who doesn't want to pay for someone else's mess. His name is Cipriano Castro, small in stature, large in ambition. He takes power with a handful of loyal men and a mountain of confidence. He wraps himself in nationalism. He speaks like Venezuela is sacred ground, and creditors are trespassers. Castro arrives in Caracas and finds the same thing every ruler finds, an empty treasury and a full stack of overdue bills. European creditors want payment, compensation for seized property, interest on old loans, damages from Civil War chaos. Castro looks at the demands and basically says, no, foreigners took risks doing business here, he argues. Now they want protection from consequences. He refuses. He suspends payments. He delays. He audits claims. He drags his feet. And that's when Europe makes a brutal decision. If diplomacy can't move him, the Navy will. In the 19th century mindset, sovereign debt isn't just finance. It's honor, status, credibility. If a small nation can default and survive, others might try it too. And for empires built on global money flows, that's not just annoying. That's existential. So London and Berlin start looking at Venezuela like a lesson, a message, a warning shot. Now watch how cynical great power logic can be. Britain and Germany are rivals, suspicious, competitive, watching each other constantly. But debt has a way of creating temporary friendships. British investors are furious. They want protection for their money. They want the empire to act like an empire. Germany, meanwhile, is hungry for prestige, a rising power with a growing navy and something to prove. To Germany, Venezuela isn't just a debtor, it's a stage. So an uncomfortable partnership forms, not because they like each other, because the math lines up. They draft a plan. Sail to Venezuela, blockade the ports, seize ships, force payment. And here's the terrifying detail. The goal isn't conquest, it's cash flow. Because blockading a port doesn't just punish pride, It shuts down the bloodstream of the state. Venezuela's government lives on customs revenue. Tariffs, port fees, exports. Cut that off and the state starts to suffocate. December 1902. An ultimatum lands in Caracas. Pay the debts, pay the claims now. Castro refuses. And he refuses for one big reason. He thinks the United States will stop Europe. He thinks the Monroe Doctrine is a shield. No European power should use force in the Americas. That's the idea. But Castro learns the difference between a principle and a policy. Because America's president is Theodore Roosevelt, and Roosevelt does not see Castro as a hero. Roosevelt sees disorder. He sees instability that invites trouble, and he sees a chance to let Europe teach a lesson, as long as Europe doesn't take territory. So the blockade begins. And once the first ship is seized, the whole thing spirals out of control. European squadrons arrive at Venezuela's ports, and they don't just stop ships. They go after Venezuela's navy, what little navy exists. Old gunboats, converted vessels, symbols more than weapons. European boarding parties seize them. Some are towed out. Some are sunk as a message. We can erase your sovereignty in an afternoon. News reaches Caracas. Rage ignites like gasoline. Crowds gather. Embassies are attacked. Foreign symbols ripped down. Castro leans into the fury. He frames it as national survival, and then he escalates. Foreign citizens are arrested. Now it's not just debt, it's hostages, it's pride. It's a fuse, and when pride enters the equation, the cannons start to look reasonable. This brings us back to Puerto Cabello, the fort, the customs house, the center of revenue. Shells strike stone. Stone becomes dust. A blockade is one thing, bombardment is another, because bombardment says, we're not just collecting, we're willing to kill for the invoice. Venezuela's economy snaps. Coffee and cocoa can't leave. Imports can't enter. Food tightens. Money dries up. And here's the lethal part. Customs revenue, often the core of state income, collapses. A government without revenue isn't a government. It's a man with a title and no oxygen. And that's when the real audience wakes up. The United States. At first, America watches, half interested, half annoyed, but pictures travel, stories spread. And Americans start hearing a simple sentence. European monarchies are bombarding a country in the Americas. That hits a nerve. Because even if Venezuela is messy, even if Castro is reckless, the optics are brutal. Old world empires using steel and fire in the new world. Meanwhile, a U.S. fleet sits nearby. Coal in the bunkers. Engines tested. Guns polished. A silent threat, not spoken, but understood. And then one more player joins the feeding frenzy, and Washington realizes it could lose control of the entire Caribbean. Italy joins in, too, because once you prove that force can accelerate repayment, every creditor wants a seat at the table. Now it's not two powers, it's a coalition of collection. Venezuela is surrounded, ports choked, trade strangled. Castro tries a new move, arbitration, a neutral court, a controlled settlement, a way to stop the shelling. This puts Theodore Roosevelt in the center of the storm, because now the question isn't, should Venezuela pay? The question is, who controls the hemisphere when payment requires cannons? And rumors start circulating, rumors that change everything. Germany might not leave. In Washington, the nightmare scenario is whispered. What if Germany doesn't just collect? What if Germany stays? A permanent foothold, a naval base, a German anchor in the Caribbean. For the United States, that's not just a problem, that's a strategic emergency. Because the Caribbean is the approach route to the future Panama Canal, and the canal is the artery of American power. If a European empire plants a flag there, America's backyard becomes a battlefield. Roosevelt realizes something fast. He gave Europe room to spank Venezuela, but he may have given Germany room to expand. And then the Germans push their luck, and the situation nearly detonates. Early 1903, a German gunboat moves aggressively near a strategic waterway. Then a mistake. It runs aground. Venezuelan guns seize the moment. Shots ring out, hits land, Germany is furious, and retaliation follows. A coastal town is hit, buildings burn, civilians die. Now the story changes tone. This isn't a financial pressure campaign anymore. This looks like war. American newspapers erupt. Public opinion shifts hard. Roosevelt now faces a decision. Let Europe keep escalating or stop it himself. And what Roosevelt does next becomes the blueprint for a century of U.S. intervention. Venezuela is choking under blockade. The ports are silent. The revenue is dying. Europe is pushing for payment. Germany is flirting with something bigger. And Theodore Roosevelt is pacing in the White House, realizing the truth. The Monroe Doctrine isn't a spell. It's a promise. And if America can't enforce it, it's just ink on paper. Roosevelt doesn't wake up worried about Venezuela. He wakes up worried about precedent. Because if Germany can blockade a country in the Americas and get paid, then every European creditor learns the same lesson. Debt is enforceable by canon, and that means the Caribbean becomes an auction house. Whoever shows up with the biggest guns wins the first cut. But Roosevelt has an even deeper fear. Not the blockade, not the shells. The word nobody says out loud, base. A permanent German base in the Caribbean would be a dagger, pointed at the future Panama Canal, pointed at American trade, pointed at American pride. So Roosevelt needs to end this. Fast. Without looking weak, and without starting a war. Here's where the story turns from loud history to quiet history. Roosevelt brings in the German ambassador. No grand public speech. No press conference. Just a message behind closed doors. Arbitrate. Now. Because if Germany tries to seize territory, if Germany tries to stay, the United States will treat it like an invasion. And Roosevelt doesn't say we disapprove. He signals steel. The Atlantic Fleet is nearby, cold, ready. Not a suggestion, a clock. This is the moment diplomacy stops being polite and becomes a loaded gun on the table. Germany suddenly realizes geography matters. They're powerful, but they're far from home. And in this hemisphere, America can concentrate force faster than Europe can. Britain isn't eager to fight America over Venezuela. Britain wants its money, not a new enemy. And Britain knows something Germany doesn't want to admit. If the U.S. Navy joins the game, the math changes instantly. So Britain begins to cool, quietly, politely, but unmistakably. Germany senses it. That uncomfortable feeling when your ally becomes a spectator. And now the Kaiser faces a choice. Keep pressing and risk war with the United States, or take the off-ramp and call it a victory. The solution arrives wearing a suit. Arbitration. A way for Europe to get paid without occupying land, and a way for Roosevelt to enforce the Monroe Doctrine without firing a shot. The blockade winds down. The warships don't disappear, but the pressure shifts, from shells to paperwork. And here's the irony. The guns are quiet now, but the most dangerous decision of the crisis is still ahead. Venezuela agrees to a deal. A portion of customs revenue, the lifeblood of the state, will be carved out and handed to creditors. Think about what that means. A foreign debt doesn't just demand payment. It demands control of your bloodstream. Every ship that docks, every crate unloaded, every export shipped. A slice is taken before Venezuela even touches it. So Europe doesn't need to annex Venezuela if it can annex Venezuela's cash flow. Now comes the legal battle. The question is simple, but explosive. Do the countries that used force, Britain, Germany, Italy, get paid first? They argue, we enforced the debt. We spent money blockading, we took the risk. We deserve priority. Other creditors argue, no. Equal treatment, no rewards for violence. This isn't just a legal debate. It's a rule book for the future. Because if the court rewards the blockaders, it tells the world a terrifying truth. Violence is profitable. The ruling lands like thunder. The blockaders get preference. Read that again in plain language. If you want to be paid first, bring a fleet. Latin America hears the message immediately. Any creditor nation can claim unpaid debts and then justify force, and then get rewarded for it. It turns sovereign debt into a pretext for intervention. And one man in Argentina looks at this and says, "No, this can't be allowed to stand." Argentina's foreign minister, Luis Drago, responds with a doctrine, a principle, a warning, a shield made of words. He argues something radical for the age. Public debt should never justify armed intervention. Investors take risks. If a country can't pay, that's finance, not a reason to bomb ports. It's a moral argument, and a legal one. And Latin America rallies around it because they can see the trap closing. Retention hook, but Roosevelt doesn't see the Drago Doctrine as a solution. He sees it as a sign that the system is breaking. Roosevelt reads the situation like a strategist. He doesn't ask, "Is debt collection by force fair?" He asks, "What happens if Europe keeps doing it?" Because if Europe keeps intervening to collect debts, America either accepts European warships in the Caribbean or America intervenes first. And Roosevelt chooses first. This is where the Monroe Doctrine mutates, from Europe stays out to America steps in. In 1904, Roosevelt announces the upgrade, the Roosevelt Corollary. The idea is blunt, even if the language is polished. If a Latin American country can't keep order or can't pay its obligations, the United States may intervene to prevent European intervention. It's framed as protection, but it's also a claim. The U.S. will manage the hemisphere's stability by force if necessary. And once you give yourself the job of policeman, you start finding reasons to patrol. Here's the practical version of the corollary. If a country defaults, the U.S. steps in, seizes the customs houses, collects revenue, pays creditors, not always with kindness, not always with consent, but with efficiency. It's a financial occupation without annexation. And it spreads, because Washington convinces itself it's preventing chaos and preventing European footholds and preventing war. But for the countries on the receiving end, it feels like something else. A new empire wearing a different uniform. Back in Venezuela, Castro survives, technically, but he's weaker. The economy is bruised. Foreign powers are watching him like a problem that might return, and then his health collapses. He leaves the country for treatment. That's the mistake, because power hates a vacuum, and his vice president, Juan Vicente Gomez, is waiting. And here's the cold reality. Castro fought the empires, but the man who replaces him makes a deal with the new empire. Gomez moves while Castro is abroad, and the United States doesn't rush to save Castro because Castro is chaos, and Gomez is order. Order pays debts. Order protects investments. Order keeps ports stable. Castro is left stranded in exile. A man who defied battleships, now blocked from returning by the new balance of power. And then, in 1914, Venezuela's story changes forever, because the ground itself starts printing money. Oil is discovered, and suddenly the debt crisis that summoned battleships fades into the background. Because once a country becomes strategically valuable, creditors stop acting like creditors and start acting like partners. Foreign companies arrive, infrastructure is built, money flows differently now, but the memory remains. The story of 1902 becomes a national scar, a legend, a warning passed forward. And decades later, politicians will pull that scar open on purpose because it still works. The gunboats vanish, but the lesson stays. It becomes a story Venezuelans tell about sovereignty, about humiliation, about foreign pressure. Later leaders resurrect Castro's rhetoric, the insolent foot of the foreigner, the idea that the world is always trying to collect something from you. And in that way, 1902 never really ends. So the Venezuelan crisis isn't just a weird episode about debt. It's a pivot point. Europe tried to enforce the old world's rules. America answered by writing new rules. Rules that said, no European gunboats here, but also rules that implied, if someone must intervene, it will be us. The most dangerous thing about the Venezuela crisis wasn't the shells, it was the rule it created. From this moment on, the world understood something new. Debt was no longer just an economic issue. It was a security issue. And in the Western Hemisphere, the United States had just declared itself the final arbiter of both. Roosevelt didn't need to send troops into Venezuela to win. He only needed to demonstrate that any future crisis would be handled on American terms. That signal traveled faster than any battleship. The first test came almost immediately. In 1904, the Dominican Republic was bankrupt. Civil wars had gutted the economy. Foreign creditors, mostly European, were demanding repayment. It looked exactly like Venezuela all over again. But this time, no European fleets appeared on the horizon. Instead, American officials did something new. They walked into the Dominican customs houses and took the keys. No invasion, no declaration of war, just paperwork. The U.S. government announced it would temporarily manage Dominican customs revenue. 55% of all incoming money would go straight to foreign creditors. The rest would keep the government running. This was the Roosevelt Corollary in action. Debt enforcement without gunfire. This was a revolution in imperial control. Old empires conquered territory. The new system conquered cash flow. The Dominican Republic kept its flag, kept its anthem, kept its president, but it no longer controlled its money. And money is sovereignty's nervous system. Once that system is outsourced, independence becomes theater. From Washington's perspective, the model worked. No European intervention. Debts paid on schedule, trade stabilized, so the policy expanded. Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba. Each case followed the same pattern. 1. Political instability. 2. Financial insolvency. 3. Fear of European creditors. 4. U.S. intervention. 5. Control of customs and banks. The Marines became the visible arm of the Treasury. Haiti was the most tragic example. By 1915, the country was in chaos. Presidents were being overthrown with alarming regularity. Foreign debts loomed. When violence peaked, the United States landed Marines. Within days, they seized Haiti's national bank. They physically removed gold reserves and transferred them to New York for safekeeping. This wasn't occupation for conquest. It was occupation for balance sheets. Haiti would remain under U.S. control for nearly 20 years. The justification was always the same: stability, debt, order. In Nicaragua, the pattern hardened into doctrine. The U.S. intervened to protect customs revenue, backed compliant leaders, crushed rebellions. When resistance movements emerged, they were framed not as political movements, but as threats to financial order. The ledger had become sacred, and anyone who threatened it was treated as an outlaw. Here's the contradiction at the heart of the Roosevelt Corollary. It was sold as protection for Latin America against European imperialism, but it required constant American intervention to maintain that protection. Europe stayed out. America moved in. Gunboats were replaced by Marines, admirals by administrators. The empire didn't disappear. It changed uniforms. Americans didn't see themselves as conquerors. They told themselves a different story. Europe exploited. America stabilized. Europe took land. America fixed finances. It was a comforting narrative. But for the people living under customs receiverships and foreign-controlled banks, the distinction was academic. A foreign hand was still on the wheel. The role came with consequences. Interventions bred resentment. Resentment bred resistance. Resistance justified more intervention. The United States found itself trapped by its own logic. If it pulled out, Europe might return. If it stayed, it became the very empire it claimed to oppose. This tension would define U.S.-Latin American relations for the next century. Back in Venezuela, the lesson was absorbed deeply. The crisis of 1902 became a political myth, a warning about foreign debt, a warning about imperial pressure, a warning about weakness. Future leaders would invoke it again and again, not always accurately, but always powerfully. When oil transformed Venezuela after 1914, the fear of gunboats faded, but the fear of dependency did not. Oil replaced coffee. Petrodollars replaced customs revenue. but the underlying vulnerability remained. A nation tied to a single income stream is always one crisis away from pressure. Only the tools change. The 20th century ended. The ironclads rusted away, but the logic survived. Today, force doesn't always arrive as battleships. Sometimes it arrives as sanctions, as frozen accounts, as blocked trade routes. The weapons are quieter. The leverage is the same. This is the equation the Venezuela crisis revealed. If a nation cannot pay, someone will decide how. If it resists, pressure escalates. And if it lacks allies strong enough to intervene, it becomes an example. Empires no longer need to conquer land. They only need to control the exit ramps of money. Roosevelt's big stick wasn't a weapon. It was a guarantee. A guarantee that the United States would decide who used force in the Americas. Sometimes that prevented bloodshed. Sometimes it caused it. But it always reinforced one reality: sovereignty without solvency is temporary. The Venezuela crisis of 1902 isn't just a historical curiosity. It's the moment the world learned that finance and firepower are inseparable. That lesson echoes today in debt negotiations, in currency crises, in international bailouts. The tools have changed. The pressure hasn't. If you owe the bank a little money, you have a problem. If you owe the bank a lot of money, you might have a navy in your harbor. That was true in 1902. It's true now. The only difference is how quietly it happens. The ironclads of Puerto Cabello have vanished, but the ledger they enforced is still being balanced. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.